He created some of the most intense music in the history of metal, yet he was a person who avoided violence, disliked showmanship, and lived almost in seclusion. Chuck Schuldiner lives in public memory as the father of death metal, a title filled with power, but one that also obscures another truth. Behind guitar riffs that cut like blades was a sensitive, solitary soul, haunted by death not to shock, but to understand it. Chuck's talent emerged early, sharp and uncompromising. While many artists of his era used extremity to attract attention, he used it to ask questions. His music did not seek to please anyone. It challenged, pushing listeners into the darker regions of consciousness where pain, loss, and human identity collide head-on. That choice earned him profound respect, but it also brought isolation, misunderstanding, and a harsh creative journey. Success arrived alongside pressure. Glory walked hand in hand with loss, and the cost of refusing to compromise was always higher than imagined. So what shaped a person both so ferocious and so fragile? Why, more than 2 decades after his passing, is Chuck Schuldiner remembered not only as a musical legend, but as a symbol of honesty and pain in art. That story began very early, and it was never smooth. That opposition did not arise on its own. It was formed very early, long before Chuck Schuldiner knew anything about stages, spotlights, or titles of any kind. To understand why he wrote about death with such cold clarity, one has to return to his early years, where everything unfolded quietly, without dramatic spectacle, yet deeply enough to leave a mark on the rest of his life. Chuck was born on May 13, 1967, in Long Island, New York, into an ordinary working-class family. Not wealthy, not connected to professional art. When he was very young, his family moved to Florida, a quieter environment far from cultural centers, where childhood passed among familiar suburban streets. Chuck was not a standout child. He was quiet, socially withdrawn, often standing outside the loud games of other kids. And school did not give him a sense of belonging. Teachers saw only a silent boy with average grades who did not attract attention. Everything changed when the family faced its greatest loss. His brother Frank died in a car accident. That death did not produce dramatic outward reactions, but it quietly shifted the entire inner world of Chuck Schuldiner. From that moment on, death was no longer an abstract idea. It became a constant question, existing alongside daily life. Not a sensational obsession, but a persistent inquiry. Why do humans exist, and what waits after everything ends? The family bought Chuck a guitar as a way to help him through the grief. No one expected that this simple choice would open the only path that made him feel truly alive. The guitar did not enter his life merely as an instrument, but as a private room, a place where he could shut the door on the world and sit alone with thoughts he could not name. In that space, Chuck did not seek instant release. He patiently explored each sound, repeating riffs until they were no longer just noise, but an ordered flow. The intensity appeared early, yet it was never chaotic. From the very beginning, the way he placed rhythm, divided phrases, and let melody guide structure showed a rare awareness for a self-taught teenager. Music could be heavy, but it must not be messy. It could be angry, but it had to say something. That's what set Chuck apart was not that he played faster or heavier than others, but that he did not treat extreme music as a shock tool. With no desire for image building or aggressive posturing, he focused almost entirely on sound. Long hours alone in his room created a very personal inner language. Guitar riffs that were both rigid and shaped, carrying sustained tension rather than explosive bursts. It was music that reflected a mind always self-controlled, always questioning, rarely surrendering to impulse. From that room, the first ideas began to move beyond the personal. In 1983, at just 16, Chuck started looking for people who could play with him, not to share the spotlight, but to realize the music forming in his head. Mantas was formed with Rick Ross and Cam Lee, not as a typical teenage band, but as a rough laboratory. The equipment was poor, there was no real studio, yet Chuck had already begun imposing clear standards. Riffs had to be precise, timing had to be tight, and structures could not be arbitrary. The first demos, Death by Metal, Reign of Terror, Infernal Death, were recorded under limited conditions, yet carried unusual weight. They did not drift in chaos like many extreme metal releases of the time. Even when the speed was pushed high, the music kept a clear axis, feeling like a machine in operation rather than an uncontrolled explosion. Those cassette tapes quickly circulated through the underground, moving beyond Florida to Europe through tape trading networks. Chuck had no fame, no contract, but the name Mantas began appearing in quiet exchanges among those searching for something heavier than thrash, faster than speed metal, and more serious than anything they had heard. Though no one yet called it death metal, Chuck was already ahead of the term. His music did not just increase intensity, it changed the entire atmosphere, colder, denser, and marked by near-obsessive focus. While many contemporaries were still caught between speed and image, Chuck quietly separated himself from the common orbit. Mantas did not last long as a stable collective. Differences in musical vision emerged early. From those frictions, Chuck gradually realized that the path ahead would not allow compromise. What he was pursuing did not require numbers or agreement. It required a will strong enough to keep the music from being bent from its very first steps. The frictions during the Mantas period were not loud, but they were enough to reveal a truth that Chuck Schuldiner was forced to confront early on. The music he was pursuing could not survive within a structure built on compromise. The name Mantas, tied to the earliest days of experimentation, gradually became too small for the vision that was expanding. When Chuck renamed the band Death, it was not an image-driven decision, but a statement of intent. This music was no longer just about heaviness or speed. It was more direct, colder, and carried a clear awareness of finality, something that had lived in his mind since early on. That change brought fractures. Cam Lee left, then Rick Ross also departed. Differences in musical perception and discipline could not be reconciled. Chuck did not argue to make anyone stay. He chose to continue quietly, accepting that this path might leave him alone. From that point forward, Death no longer functioned like a traditional band. It became a personal, creative space where every decision, song structure, drum patterns, layers of guitar, had to pass through a single filter. Chuck moved frequently, working short-term with different musicians, not to find stability, but to sharpen ideas that were becoming increasingly severe and precise. The pressure of those years did not come from outside, but from his own growing perfectionism. When Death entered the studio for the debut album, Chuck carried everything he had accumulated, riffs written in silence, structures revised until no room for spontaneity remained. Scream Bloody Gore emerged in 1987 under far from ideal conditions, yet the music inside carried rare decisiveness. There was no decorative excess, no space to experiment for fun. Chuck wrote nearly all the music and tightly controlled the recording process, as if aware that loosening a single detail could cause everything he was building to collapse. The album did not need a massive promotional campaign to spread. It found its own path, from small record shops into the hands of listeners searching for something more extreme than previous standards. Roughly 100,000 copies sold for extreme metal at the time was not merely a commercial achievement. It was proof that a new language had been accepted. Scream Bloody Gore did not just open a genre, it set a standard. Death metal could be raw, but not careless, brutal, but structured. Instead of pausing to enjoy that rare attention, Chuck pushed death further. Leprosy in 1988 showed a clear evolution. The sound became tighter, sharper, riffs arranged like precisely fitted pieces of metal. Death was no longer seen as a fleeting shock. But those who had viewed Scream Bloody Gore as a one-off jolt began to see that Chuck was building a complete system, where each album marked a deliberate step forward. Over time, Leprosy stood alongside foundational metal works as a near unreachable benchmark. Throughout this, Chuck did not seek relief. He drove himself deeper into pressure, as if only near the edge could the music speak what he needed it to say. After Leprosy, the pressure shifted. It was no longer about proving how heavy death could be, but about a harder question. What was this music saying beyond surface violence? Chuck Schuldiner began to feel that the gore imagery, which once shocked, now felt too narrow to contain his increasingly complex thoughts. With spiritual healing, the shift was not abrupt in sound, but in focus. The riffs remained sharp, the speed urgent, but the meaning beneath had moved. Chuck turned his attention to more sensitive territories: religious manipulation, ethical boundaries in medicine, the ways people harm others in the name of belief. Songs like Living Monstrosity and Pull the Plug did not aim to shock through imagery, but through discomfort, forcing listeners to face reality. This choice immediately divided the community. Some traditional death metal fans reacted strongly, claiming Chuck had strayed from the genre's essence. For Chuck, it was not betrayal. It was a boundary that had to be crossed if the music was to remain honest to his thoughts. The mixed reactions did not slow him. They pushed him into deeper self-examination. If death metal could address ethics and consciousness, why remain bound to simple structures? From that question came a leap. When Human began taking shape, Chuck sought not just skilled players, but minds that could follow his musical thinking. Bringing in Sean Reinert and Paul Masvidal, musicians with jazz and progressive backgrounds, was not for technical display, but to expand expressive space. The music on Human became dense with information. Odd time signatures appeared constantly. Song structures broke familiar molds. Transitions occurred unexpectedly, but not randomly. Chuck's guitar no longer led only through weight, but through intellectual tension, forcing the listener to follow every shift. Alongside that complexity, the lyrics turned inward. Human did not shout at the world. It spoke to the writer himself, questioning identity, freedom, and human limits within social systems. This blend of high technique and inner depth pushed the album beyond conventional extreme metal. Estimated sales of 150,000 to 200,000 copies showed audiences did not reject the change as many feared. Human came to be seen not just as a successful album, but as a milestone that opened technical death metal, where heavy music no longer opposed thought, and extremity became a tool for digging deeper, not hiding difficult questions. After Human, Chuck Schuldiner no longer stood in a position where he had to prove whether death metal could evolve. And the question became more private and more severe. How could the music continue to reflect a changing mind without losing honesty with himself? Individual thought patterns emerged from that state. The arrival of Steve DiGiorgio with his fretless bass gave death a completely different sense of motion, while Gene Hoglan introduced a mechanical weight, precise to the point of near brutality. The music no longer revolved only around technique. It carried a feeling of compression, like a stream of thought forced to operate within ever-tightening frameworks. The songs on this album circled themes of personal freedom, invisible social control, and skepticism toward systems built in the name of order. Chuck's guitar here was sharp but not showy. Each riff felt like a question repeated with increasingly tense variations. Loneliness was more present than ever, not as tragedy, but as the constant state of someone who always thinks independently. That uncompromising stance gradually made Death the most respected name in extreme metal. They did not dominate charts or mainstream media, yet within heavy music circles, the name Death began to be spoken with rare caution and respect. The pressure that came with that respect was not light. Chuck narrowed his circle of collaborators further, tightening control over every detail. When Symbolic took shape, he did not try to make Death more accessible, but to balance elements that seemed opposed. The technique remained high, yet no longer overshadowed emotion. Melody was given space to breathe, to guide listeners through shifting mental states. Songs like Crystal Mountain and Empty Words did not point outward at a specific enemy. They turned inward, like diary pages written in sound, where doubt and longing coexisted. That subtle shift helped Symbolic move beyond the traditional extreme metal audience. Metal press embraced it as a mature work, while parts of mainstream media began to notice Death as an artistic phenomenon, not just a heavy band. There was no loud explosion, but the accumulating numbers told another story. Total sales of Death's albums surpassed 1 million copies, a rare achievement for a project that consistently refused to flatter taste. In that space, Chuck kept walking alone, carrying the sense that every step forward was paid for with growing isolation, even as his music was heard more widely than ever. After Symbolic, a different kind of impasse appeared. Not because Chuck had run out of ideas, but because he increasingly sensed that Death had reached its own limits. The music could still be heavier, faster, more complex. But the larger question was whether it could still say something new to its creator. The sound of perseverance formed under that tension, as an attempt to push Death as far as possible before repetition set in. The music on this album felt upward-reaching, almost urgent, where technique, progressive structures, and melody fused at unprecedented density. Chuck's guitar no longer just cut through space. It twisted, climbed, pulling his voice into high, strained registers, as if each song were a struggle with physical and mental limits. Amid that storm, Voice of the Soul appeared like a held breath. No lyrics, no screams, only bare melodic lines placed close together, carrying deeper self-questioning than any prior words. In an album dense to the point of suffocation, the relative silence of this track was not rest, but confrontation. It led many to feel that Chuck was saying goodbye in his own way. No loud declaration, no long explanation, just a pause long enough for listeners to understand that Death had reached where it needed to go. The decision to end Death did not come from exhaustion or failure, but from harsh honesty with himself. Chuck would not continue simply to maintain a name that had become symbolic. When he no longer felt the possibility of evolution, he was ready to close the most important chapter of his life. And even if that meant giving up a position thousands of bands desired. Yet that closing was not retreat. Even as Death stopped, another direction was being prepared. Control Denied emerged as a new space for Chuck to breathe. There, he stepped away from growled vocals and familiar brutality, moving toward clean singing, melodic structures, and clearer progressive influences. The fragile art of existence was not a betrayal of the past, but the part left unsaid during the years of Death. The music remained complex and technically demanding, yet emotion stood at the center, exposed and vulnerable. For many, this album felt like a door opening to a different future for Chuck, one where he could continue deepening his ideas without genre constraints. In those melodies, there was no sense of ending, only a path left unfinished, and as if everything had only just begun to be drawn. When Death came to a close and Control Denied had just opened another door, Chuck Schuldiner's private life also experienced a moment that seemed as if it might pull him out of the familiar orbit of solitude. In the early 1990s, as Death began receiving wider attention after Human, Chuck met Kelly Schuldiner. There was no typical rock scene story of parties or backstage lights. The relationship formed quietly, in keeping with the way Chuck approached life, slowly, cautiously, and far from display. Kelly did not belong to the loud musical world Chuck inhabited. That very ordinariness became a rare anchor. For someone who always felt like an outsider to the industry he helped shape, her presence suggested the possibility of a different life, one where music was not the only center. In 1991, during a period of strong transition for Death, they married. No lavish wedding, no press images. Everything happened discreetly, almost detached from the public image of the father of death metal. Their married life was rarely spoken of, partly because Chuck kept a clear boundary between work and private life, partly because he was not used to sharing the most fragile parts of himself. Those years were filled with dense schedules, growing creative pressure, and an uncompromising perfectionism that left little room for lightness. Silence had always been his safe space, but in shared life, silence can also become distance. As Death continued changing lineups, as the albums grew more mentally heavy and spiritually isolating, differences in rhythm of living slowly surfaced. By the mid-1990s, the marriage came to an end. The divorce happened quietly. No public disputes, no explanations to the media. Kelly left Chuck's life the way she had entered it, silently. Afterward, Chuck did not remarry, nor did he publicly acknowledge other relationships. This separation was never turned into lyrical material, never repeated as a story. It remained a space of absence, blending into the growing sense of solitude present in his later music. In the years that followed, as Death approached its final limits and control denied began to take shape, Chuck returned to his smallest circle, music and his immediate family. His relationship with Kelly, though brief, marked a rare attempt to step outside the enclosed world he had known since early on. The inability to hold on to that life, to reconcile shared domestic existence with a creative path that allowed no compromise, reflected Chuck Schuldiner himself, an artist capable of opening an entirely new genre, yet always struggling to find a place within the ordinary frameworks of personal life. When Control Denied had only just opened a new direction, Chuck Schuldiner's body began sending signals no one wanted to hear. Severe headaches appeared without pattern, lingering and relentless. His vision blurred. Moments of lost focus occurred even while he held a guitar, something almost unthinkable for someone who controlled the smallest movement of sound. At first, everything was dismissed as the result of prolonged stress, of years spent working under constant pressure. But the symptoms did not retreat. They advanced, quietly and mercilessly. In late 1999, the diagnosis placed Chuck in an entirely different reality: pontine glioma, a rare and malignant brain tumor located in an extremely sensitive region where every intervention carried high risk. On December 13, 1999, he entered surgery with the fragile hope that time might be bought, even in short fragments. The operation was considered technically successful, yet no true sense of safety existed with such an illness. What followed was a long, invasive, exhausting sequence of treatments: chemotherapy, radiation, and anxious waiting to see how his body would respond. Alongside physical pain came another crisis, no less cold. Chuck had no health insurance. Medical costs quickly surpassed personal means, placing heavy financial pressure on his family. In that moment, at the global metal community, people who had been touched by his music began to connect. Benefit concerts were organized, donations arrived from around the world, not as obligation, but as a natural reflex towards someone who had changed the way they heard and thought about heavy music. Between treatments, when his body allowed, Chuck still turned to the guitar. Not for grand recordings, not to prove anything, but as an act of survival. His fingers no longer always obeyed. His strength was unstable, yet music remained the final thread connecting him to himself. Some days he could play only briefly before fatigue overtook him. Some days, simply holding the instrument was enough to steady his spirit. Time moved on in its own rhythm, indifferent to unfinished paths. On December 13th, 2001, exactly 2 years after his first surgery, Chuck Schuldiner passed away at home, in the arms of family. No hospital, no loud machines, only familiar faces at the closest distance. He died at 34, with many creative roads still open ahead, leaving a heavy silence in the community that had stood beside him through a long, uneven fight. His funeral took place quietly, in keeping with the way he had lived, away from life's real-world spotlight. No spectacle, no rows of cameras. Yet at that same time, across the world, small bedroom speakers, worn headphones, and garage stereos began playing familiar songs. People did not speak much. They let human, symbolic, voice of the soul speak. Death did not need an official moment of silence. The music did that for them. Chuck Schuldiner is gone, but his legacy does not rest inside numbers or lists of honors. Still, those numbers reveal the scale. Over 1 million albums sold in a genre never friendly to mass markets. 7 studio albums with death, each opening a new step for extreme metal, a control-denied project left unfinished, yet proving his thinking could have gone much further. His name continues appearing in rankings of the greatest and most influential metal guitarists, not as nostalgia, but as a benchmark. But his true legacy lies not in what he did, but in what he allowed others to do afterward. Before Chuck, death metal was largely instinctive reflex, faster, heavier, more violent. After Chuck, it became a structured language with thought and philosophy. He proved that extreme music need not be emotionally cold, and high technique did not mean lifelessness. Generations of musicians in technical death metal, progressive metal, and beyond carry traces of that approach: seriousness, discipline, and the drive to keep evolving. Chuck never tried to become a symbol. He built no image, sought no industry power, chased no trend. That refusal made him a rare ethical standard in metal, an artist placing creative honesty above fame, willing to end death when he felt it could go no further. For many, that lesson outweighs any solo. That art only holds meaning when the artist is brutally honest with himself. Today, when a band plays complex riffs yet keeps a soul intact, when a heavy album dares to speak about thought, ethics, and identity, Chuck Schuldiner's shadow is there, not imposing, not dominating, simply present as a standard people measure themselves against. Death no longer exists as an active band, yet like its name, the music has moved beyond ordinary endings. Chuck Schuldiner is not immortal because he was perfect. He lives on because he dared to go to the furthest edge of his own thinking, even when that path led to isolation, misunderstanding, and a heavy price. And perhaps, whenever Voice of the Soul plays in a quiet space somewhere, what remains is felt most clearly: a reminder that the heaviest music is not meant to destroy, but to help people face themselves. Do you remember the first time Chuck Schuldiner's music made you stop and truly listen? Share that moment in the comments and hit like and subscribe to continue exploring the legacies that never fade in music history.